Welcome, Voyager. Tonight we drift beneath the surface, not toward light, but toward sound. Down into a place where silence doesn't quite exist. This is a story about the ocean and its voice. Not the roar of waves or the crash of surf, but something older, deeper. A kind of ringing that once echoed so far it confused scientists, haunted sonar technicians, and made sailors wonder whether the sea itself kept secrets. Before we set sail, if you've been floating along with us through these watery tales, consider liking and subscribing, and let us know your coordinates in the comments. Maybe your shore once heard something strange coming from the deep, and if so, we'd love to find it again in a future journey. Now let your breathing slow, unclench your jaw, let the tide settle. Picture yourself weightless, just beneath the surface, hearing nothing but the hush between heartbeats. Let everything else fall away, and listen. Our story tonight begins in the quietest place on Earth, the deep ocean, far beneath the rolling surface, where light cannot reach and pressure folds even metal. Sound moves in strange ways. Here, in a narrow band known as the SOFAR channel, short for sound fixing and ranging, sound can travel for thousands of kilometers without fading. It's a layer where water temperature, salinity, and pressure align just right, creating an acoustic corridor that wraps the globe. Think of it like a tunnel not made of stone or earth, but of physics. In this corridor, whales sing across entire oceans. Submarines whisper and are heard half a world away. And sometimes things ring. The first time we heard the ocean chime was by accident. In the 1960s, during the height of Cold War surveillance, hydrophones, underwater microphones, were strung along the seabed to listen for Soviet submarines. These cables caught everything: whale song, undersea landslides, volcanic eruptions. But they also caught a tone no one expected. A low, harmonic echo that rang out for minutes at a time, sometimes repeating days later. It was deep and resonant, almost musical, and unlike anything the engineers had logged before. At first, they assumed it was man-made, a new kind of vessel or an unknown beacon. But no known technology matched the sound's pitch or strength, and it was always faint, not loud like a sonar ping, but broad, humming through the water with the patience of a bell swinging in slow motion. Later, the Navy released parts of these recordings to civilian researchers, and the mystery deepened. The chime wasn't constant, but it was consistent, and it traveled. One tone could ripple across entire ocean basins. This wasn't myth, it was recorded fact. And the deeper researchers listened, the more they heard. Strange pulses, mechanical hums, rhythmic tones that seemed to echo from undersea ridges, trenches, and sometimes from places with no obvious origin at all. One sound, later nicknamed the bloop, was recorded in 1997 off the Southern Pacific and was so loud, it could be heard by sensors more than 3,000 miles apart. For a time, some speculated it came from a giant, undiscovered creature. But later analysis traced it to ice quakes, massive blocks of ice shifting and cracking under pressure in Antarctica. That explanation answered the source, but not the tone. Because here's the thing: many underwater events create sound, but only a few make music. That's what intrigued oceanographers. Some of the undersea tones weren't just bursts or crashes. They were shaped. They had rising pitches, falling harmonics, and sometimes even rhythm. In 1991, researchers off the coast of Japan recorded what became known as the slowdown, a strange, descending tone that lasted over 7 minutes, as though something enormous had groaned through the water and drifted into silence. Years later, they matched the sound to an iceberg running aground. But the noise wasn't what anyone expected from such a collision. It was too slow, too clean, too much like a drawn-out note, as if the ice and sea had agreed to make music instead of chaos. In another case, Hydrophones captured what scientists call harmonic tremor, a sustained seismic tone produced by volcanic activity beneath the ocean floor. Off the coast of the Mariana Islands, in a part of the sea few ships ever visit, these tremors sounded like long, slow peals. Underwater bells, not made of brass, but of magma and pressure and rock shifting gently under layers of salt water. The Mariana Trench, the deepest point in the ocean, is one of the most acoustically active places on Earth. And yet, it's also one of the quietest because the sounds that move through it are often beyond human hearing. We record them with machines, but we feel them in strange ways. Vibrations, pressure changes, that odd sense of something near, even when unseen. There's a term some researchers use: acoustic shadows, places where sounds should be loud, but are inexplicably dampened. These shadows exist even underwater, shaped by geography and current. But sometimes the opposite happens. A place with no known origin will ring out with clarity. It doesn't match any tectonic event, or shipping route, or marine animal. It's just there. A single peal, like a bell without a tower, carried through black water. People often ask why we should care about these things. They're just sounds. They don't sink ships or guide storms. But for those who live by or with the sea, sound is more than vibration. It's presence. It's the proof that something vast and alive is still in motion. Not threatening, just moving. Not always seen, but always heard. And sometimes sound becomes story. Aboard research ships, marine scientists have nicknames for certain noises. The hum, the hinge, the ping that fades, each tagged and tracked like a character in a long underwater play. Some believe we've only cataloged a fraction of what the sea has to say. New hydrophones go deeper each year, and every deployment brings another riddle. Sounds that repeat only in spring, echoes that circle the globe, patterns that resemble language but don't repeat, and always the quiet tolling, low, slow, and unmistakable. When sailors spoke of bells heard at sea centuries ago, it was easy to assume myth. Echoes from churches on land, hallucinations in fog. But perhaps not all those stories were inventions. Perhaps the sea has always rung. We just didn't know how to listen. And now we do. In the earlier centuries of ocean exploration, sound was not something to be measured. It was something to be feared or followed. Mariners spoke of phantom bells tolling in the fog, heard even when no ship or chapel was near. Some claimed these tones were the voices of drowned sailors calling others to join them. Others believed the sea itself had a conscience, and that the ringing was its breath or its warning. These weren't poetic metaphors to them. In the vast unknown, superstition and navigation often overlapped. In the North Atlantic, fishermen of the 18th century told of sea chimes that rang during storms, low pulses that seemed to roll beneath the crashing wind, too regular to be thunder. Some claimed these tones came from far beneath, where cold currents collided with ancient valleys. Even in modern times, off the coast of Newfoundland, divers have reported faint ringing in their ears when submerged at depth. Scientists explain it as a trick of pressure or as interference from sonar activity far off. But those who've heard it describe something more rhythmic, as if a bell were being struck far away, once, then again, then silence. The concept of underwater resonance goes beyond mystique. Certain geological formations can produce harmonic sound under stress. Just as a glass will hum when rubbed at the rim, so too can underwater arches, ridges, and caverns when exposed to tectonic shift or glacial tension. These tones, though subtle, can persist for hours, like the drone of a massive tuning fork embedded in the crust of the planet. One such formation lies in the Southern Ocean, near the Balleny Islands. Here, volcanic seamounts and glacial shelves create a playground of acoustic oddities. In 2001, hydrophones detected a recurring tone, a frequency that hovered just under human hearing. It would pulse every few hours, then vanish, returning days later in a slightly altered rhythm. Some researchers suspected whale communication, others proposed ice movement, but the pattern didn't fit known sources. It was not a signal exactly, not language, but it wasn't random either. To study these sounds, scientists use a tool called spectrogram analysis, where audio becomes visual patterns of color and time that reveal structure in what we otherwise hear as hum. The mysterious tone from the Balani region showed a layered, curved descent, like a spiral staircase falling through water. Those who analyzed it likened it to a bell's echo drawn out, stretched long over miles, repeating not in seconds but in days. What makes this so hypnotic isn't just the sound itself, but the consistency of its shape. Something about the undersea conditions there creates repeating harmonics, as if the sea is humming to itself, content with its own voice. And there are more such places. The Gulf of California, though better known for its vibrant marine life, also hides one of the loudest underwater features in the world, the Alarcón Rise, an active spreading ridge. Here, tectonic plates push apart, and magma oozes slowly into the sea. But unlike the explosive violence of above-ground volcanoes, these movements often release sound rather than light. In 2016, hydrophones picked up low, pulsing tones echoing across the basin. Steady, mechanical, yet entirely natural, like a heartbeat slowed to near stillness. Whales, too, use these tones. Blue whales in particular seem drawn to the Sofar channel, aligning their calls with its narrow range. Their songs can be heard across oceans, and they appear to time them for maximum resonance. A single call, pitched just right, can be traced thousands of kilometers. These creatures are not only singers, but engineers of sound. They use the ocean's structure to amplify their voices, just as a bell uses its hollow to carry tone. There is a beauty in the way marine life and geology interact. The deepest places on Earth are not silent voids, but concert halls filled with tones we are just beginning to interpret. From methane seeps in the Gulf of Mexico to the rumbles of undersea earthquakes off Tonga, each sound marks a conversation we've only recently learned how to hear. And it raises a question. If the sea rings like a bell, who or what is listening? We often think of ourselves as observers of nature, distant and apart. But sound does not respect borders. The same tone that echoes from an Antarctic iceberg may wash up as pressure on the sonar of a Japanese trawler. The ring of an undersea tremor might cause subtle vibrations in a coral reef 1,000 miles away. We are within the sound as much as beside it. Even ships themselves hum. Large tankers, cruise liners, even fishing boats contribute to what scientists call acoustic smog, a constant backdrop of low mechanical noise that affects marine life. But below that layer, beneath the thrum of diesel engines and the scrape of propellers, the deeper song persists. It is older, quieter, and more regular. When researchers filter out human interference, what remains is an elegant series of tones. Some rise and fall like breathing, others come in pairs or spirals. Some vanish and never return. Others have been ringing for decades. And in all this, there is still one particular mystery that captivates acoustic oceanographers. In the early 2000s, a series of recordings were taken near the Chromatic Trench, one of the most remote stretches of deep sea on the planet. Amid the usual tectonic rumbles and cetacean calls, a singular sound was captured. It lasted only 11 seconds. A chime, slow and deliberate, with a harmonic tail that faded over 5 full seconds. It didn't match any known event. No volcano, no ship, no creature. The tone was too symmetrical, too pure. Came once, then never again. Some suggested it was the echo of a small seamount collapsing inward. Others proposed resonance from an ice mass falling from a submerged shelf. But the recording was so clear, and the tone so familiar, that many simply referred to it as the bell. It remains unexplained, stored in the archives, occasionally used in lectures or audio exhibits. You can listen to it yourself online. It sounds, oddly, like a church bell tolling in a distant fog. But there is no church, and no air to carry sound in the sea. Only pressure, only vibration. What makes a bell, after all, is not the metal, but the silence it interrupts. And by that measure, the ocean has thousands of bells, ringing in places we've never seen. Some strike once, then disappear. Others, like the shifting ice of Antarctica, keep tolling, each crack and groan echoing through the great corridors of the deep. Even now, oceanographers are still deploying new hydrophone arrays, trying to map these events with greater clarity. They dream not just of cataloging every sound, but of creating a kind of underwater library, an atlas of tone. A place where each trench, each ridge, each seamount has its own acoustic fingerprint. A cartography not of shapes, but of sounds. And it all starts with listening. Our story continues beneath the surface, where darkness is not emptiness, but density, and the only direction is toward the source of the sound. In these underwater realms, navigation has never depended solely on light. Fish with pressure-sensitive organs feel the pulse of nearby movement, and whales align their songs with the bends of the current, using echo and delay to gauge both distance and depth. Even invertebrates, like squid and jellyfish, respond to certain frequencies with flight or stillness. The sea does not ask that you see, it asks that you listen. One of the more curious episodes in oceanic acoustics came in 1997, when the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration recorded a strange, low-frequency sound in the Pacific Ocean. It was loud enough to be heard over 5,000 kilometers away, yet its origin could not be confirmed. The sound rose quickly in frequency and then faded. It lasted only about a minute and was named, quite simply, the bloop. At first, its volume and range led some to wonder if it might be biological, possibly the call of a creature larger than any yet known. That speculation was brief and quietly passed into pop folklore, yet the mystery retained its charm. Later studies suggested it was likely the noise of an icequake, a massive crack in a glacial shelf echoing outward underwater. But the moment revealed something broader, that the ocean's voice could be heard at global scale, and that a single sound, far from any coastline, could ring in all directions like the toll of a distant bell. The ocean, after all, is not silent. It is filled with the grinding of tectonic plates, the crackle of ice, the pulses of fish, and the long, slow groans of pressure moving through trenches and ridges. Sound travels more efficiently through water than air. At certain depths, in certain bands, it can circle the globe. The Sofar Channel is one such highway, an acoustic duct in the ocean's middle layer that traps sound and lets it run flat and far, uninterrupted by surface chop or seafloor rise. During the Cold War, the U.S. Navy used this channel to detect Soviet submarines from great distances, their propellers revealing their locations in long, slow arcs of tone. But even as weapons and ships learned to move more quietly, the ocean's own sounds could not be hushed. Ice continued to fall. Plates continued to shift. Whales continued to sing. The bell kept ringing. Some scientists propose that we can track environmental change through underwater acoustics. A rise in ocean temperature alters the speed of sound. A shift in salinity changes how a tone bends or echoes. By mapping long-term changes in natural ocean noise, we can trace climate shifts, glacial retreats, even changes in migratory paths. It is a kind of listening that requires no words. The planet hums, and we begin to understand the pitch, But outside the realm of science, the sounds still carry folklore. In the Philippines, there is a belief among some coastal communities that when the sea sings late at night, it is remembered. The sound of a distant bell, they say, might be the warning of a storm not yet formed, or the farewell of a boat lost long ago. These stories aren't meant to compete with instruments and data. They serve a different memory, a kind of emotional cartography. In Iceland, too, the sea is believed to carry voices. The ringing of rockfall into the fjords, the slide of ice along basalt cliffs, even the call of gulls above, each has its meaning. And to the trained ear, they say, one can tell the shape of the land by how the echo returns. Fishermen used to say they could tell which bay they were in by the way their oars sounded against the hull. Even in modern submarines, the principle remains. Sonar operators spend years training to hear difference in tone, between rock and metal, between wreck and reef, between silence and something just beneath it. The most skilled among them speak of the sea's voice not as noise, but as character. The Mariana Trench has a drawn-out tone, slow and low. The Arctic shelf crackles like fire under glass. The mid-Atlantic ridge pulses with a mild stutter. Each place has a soundscape, and some have ghosts. In 1943, a German U-boat patrolling near the Azores reported hearing an underwater bell at regular intervals. For tolls, then silence. The captain noted it in the log, assuming it was a trick of sound from a nearby convoy. But no ships were within range, and the bell continued even as the submarine shifted position. After the war, Allied records revealed no transmission or minesweeper activity in the area. The sound was never explained. Could it have been volcanic activity, glacial ice breaking in the north, or perhaps a reef collapsing gently, grain by grain? The ocean does not offer transcripts, but maybe it doesn't need to, because somewhere in the sea, right now, a chime is forming. Perhaps it's a crack in an Antarctic glacier that will echo in the Sofar Channel for weeks. Perhaps it's a whale adjusting its call to thread through thermoclines. Perhaps it's the groan of a tectonic plate shifting imperceptibly, but undeniably. These aren't just noises. They are fingerprints of motion, memory, and time. And so we end tonight not with silence, but with the awareness that silence at sea is only what we haven't yet heard. That deep in the trenches or far beneath the ice, or just behind the next ridge of current, something is always singing, slowly, carefully, like a bell, swinging gently in water, calling out across the vast dark hull of the sea. If you listen closely, in the spaces between your breath, you may still hear it, not in fear, but in calm. Rest now, Voyager, in the knowledge that the oceans never sleep. They only ring slower, deeper, softer than we remember to notice. Let the sound fade gently, like a wave returning to the deep. Let your thoughts drift with it and feel the stillness settle. Good night. Welcome, Voyager. Tonight we trace a tide not on a chart, but on claws. A tale of paper lost to waves and crustaceans, of directions scrambled by the shore's smallest cartographers. This is the story of a map, said to have been lost in 1712, swallowed by the sea and returned to land not by tide nor hand, but by crabs, dozens of them, clicking and marching, dragging parchment across wet sand like tiny surveyors with no sense of scale. But before we set sail, if you often drift with us into these forgotten geographic murmurs, do like and subscribe, and leave a coordinate in the comments below. Let us know where you're listening from. If your shore has ever had its own crabby courier or wayward document, perhaps it'll land in a future tale. For now, settle in. Let your limbs go still as driftwood. Imagine the warm hush of sand underfoot, and a breeze that smells faintly of salt and old ink. Let the night fall quietly around you, and breathe slowly, as if matching the gentle rhythm of a moonlit tide. Our story tonight begins on the muddy coasts of Guyana, near a place then called Berbice, where Dutch colonial charts once struggled to keep pace with the sea's shifting banks and the ambitions of traders who tried to own the wind. The year was 1712, and the Dutch West India Company had a fragile hold on the northern edges of South America. Sugar plantations lined the river mouths, and ships arrived to trade spices, textiles, and something rarer still, knowledge of the inlets and estuaries that made this coast navigable. At that time, the coastline here was a place of illusion. The sea came far inland at high tide and retreated without warning, swallowing jetties and reshaping sandbars with the indifference of a sleeping giant. Dutch cartographers, known for their obsessive accuracy, sent surveyors to map the area's labyrinth of rivers and tidal flats. One of these men, a navigator by the name of Arend de Vries, is remembered in fragments, a ledger entry, a passing mention in a ship's manifest, and the unlikely story tied to our drifting map. According to an archival note tucked inside the Dutch National Archives, de Vries was aboard a small cutter tasked with charting a cluster of inlets near the mouth of the Corentyne River. The journey was not dramatic. The weather was passable, the tides predictable. What wasn't predictable was the gust that tore through the camp one evening, lifting a satchel from the shore and sending it into the tide before anyone could give chase. Inside the satchel was parchment, at least 2 sheets of hand-drawn maps, half complete, detailing new shoals and an unnamed islet that had appeared 2 years prior. De Vries, it said, stood barefoot at the shoreline, shouting at the water as if it might be persuaded to return the maps by logic or pride. The crew searched the beach the next morning. Nothing. But 2 days later, farther north along the coast, another party, Dutchmen resupplying a remote outpost near the Shell Beach, reported something odd. A cluster of soldier crabs, dozens if not hundreds, moving across the flats in a strange, scattered line. Some were clutching strands of papery fiber. A few were dragging something larger with edges softened by brine. A sheet of vellum, marked with faint ink. Grid lines, compass rose. By the time the sailors gathered the scraps, most were torn or pierced. Crabs, after all, are not delicate handlers of historic documents. But one portion of the map had survived intact enough to recognize the river mouths and a scribbled note. Sandbank emergent here, watch tide. The tale would have ended as a curiosity if not for what happened weeks later, when a French privateer intercepted de Vries' cutter off the coast. The French captain, amused by the rumor of crab-assisted cartography, allowed the crew to depart, but kept the ship's charts as prize. Months after that, an embellished version of the story appeared in a Dutch merchant's letter home, claiming that the crabs of Berbice now draw better maps than our own men. Whether the tale was true or a moment of gallows humor turned into legend, it stuck. So much so that when later maps were issued of the region, certain inlets bore unofficial names like Crab Reach and Claw Strand, though these did not survive into modern atlases. There is a truth buried under the crust of this tale, though. Soldier crabs, Coenobita compressus and related species, are known for their odd habits. In places like Australia and the Caribbean, they travel en masse, dragging debris with them across great distances. In the Galapagos, researchers once observed crabs carrying bits of plastic and cloth into their burrows. It's not a stretch to imagine a crab colony moving over a beach littered with damp paper, disturbing and redistributing it piece by piece, guided not by purpose, but instinct and tide. In 2006, A biologist named Stefan Gruber published a study in Marine Invertebrate Behavior noting that soldier crabs in Suriname displayed an odd affinity for fibrous materials, even dragging leaves or seaweed to reinforce their hiding holes. Though not conclusive, it suggests that stories like De Vries may have foundations in real behavior, just misunderstood, magnified, and repeated. The Guyanese coast today still tells stories, though few are written. The land moves in slow pulses. Mangroves creep and retreat. Fishermen speak of ghost rivers, places where the tide moves in reverse or vanishes mid-channel. And though no crabs have been caught with parchment and claw in modern times, the shoreline remembers how quickly information, once lost to the water, can be rewritten by whatever washes up next. It makes you wonder how many maps we've mistaken as deliberate, when in fact they were only ever accidents, muddled impressions carried in on the feet of something small. And perhaps that's part of why this tale lingers. Not because of the crabs, amusing though they are, but because we want maps to be fixed, certain, permanent. And nothing about the sea is. In colonial archives, there's one final mention of Arend de Vries, not in connection to the lost map, but in a routine log 2 years later, marking his safe return to Amsterdam and promotion to assistant chartmaker, which suggests the story didn't ruin him. Perhaps it even helped. It's hard to say, but those who sailed with him reportedly kept a habit, even years after, the practice of weighing down their satchels with stones at night and checking the shoreline for claw marks in the morning. In the decades that followed the tale of the crawling map, sailors along the Atlantic coast developed a peculiar superstition. It wasn't about storms or sirens, but paper. Some captains insisted that maps be kept sealed in barrels overnight. Others forbade writing anything near the waterline after sundown, especially on fresh parchment, as if the sea had developed a taste for inked vellum and might call upon its many-legged emissaries to retrieve it. A British hydrographer named Elias Pym recorded one such encounter in his travel journal from 1743. Anchored near the Orinoco Delta, Pym's crew spotted what they thought was a disoriented scroll drifting ashore, caught in the legs of a crab that seemed to have lost its way. When they recovered it, it was only a shredded fragment of sailcloth with a crude, childlike compass scrawled in charcoal. But the incident rattled them. They placed the cloth inside a glass bottle, sealed it with wax, and returned it to the tide the next morning, hoping, as one sailor wrote, to confuse whatever strange archive the ocean had begun to keep. That same century, mariners along the West African coast, especially in what was then called the Gold Coast, shared a similar belief. Fishermen claimed that land crabs carried lost items back inland if the sea had no use for them, including coins, bits of torn clothing, and in one curious account, a sailor's journal page, scratched in Dutch and salted stiff. That fragment, now stored in a maritime archive in Rotterdam, reads only, "Chart of the Southern Fork, marsh thick, watch for false bank, crabs walked north." Its authenticity has never been verified. By the 19th century, the era of myth and margin notes had begun to give way to stricter surveying. Triangulation, measurement by sextant, and formal hydrographic expeditions all made maps less susceptible to lore. And yet, there are still modern whispers. In 1979, a team of coastal ecologists near Suriname reported a bizarre observation during their mangrove survey. While camped along a remote beach, they awoke one morning to find their waterproofed map pinned under a rock the night before, missing. Footprints trailed down to the surf. Not human, not quite avian. When they followed them, they found the map 10 meters away, caught on driftwood with several small crabs nearby. The incident never made it beyond their field notes. And this is where the magic of stories like these begins to curl around the edges of fact. Perhaps a map lost to the sea in 1712 was never recovered by soldier crabs at all. Perhaps it was buried in mud, torn by tide, and simply reimagined by lonely sailors with a fondness for strange coincidences. But we still find meaning in the idea, don't we, that the littlest creatures, those often stepped over or swept aside, might one day carry something as weighty as a record of place. That something so fragile, paper, memory, ink, could be rescued not by force, but by accident. In Polynesian navigation traditions, there's a related but more deliberate custom. Navigators, sailing by star and swell, sometimes set small shells or stones in sand to represent islands or currents. These tactile maps, passed down orally, were never meant to survive forever. They were taught, then scattered. The sea would shift, and so too would the chart. In a way, that philosophy mirrors the story of our crab-born map, an understanding that no version of the world remains untouched. In the Philippines, there's an old term, pamahian, which refers to superstitious practices born from ancestral belief. Fisherfolk in certain coastal areas still leave small offerings at low tide, whispering hopes that lost nets or canoes might be returned. A crab dragging something across the beach in such regions wouldn't be cause for alarm, but a sign, a gesture, a reply. And who are we to say the ocean doesn't answer? Modern mapping has removed much of the uncertainty. Satellites do not lose their papers. GPS does not fear rain. And yet, cartographers today still confront mysteries. Sandbars that appear where none were, islands that vanish without explanation, undersea ridges once mistaken for land. For all our tools, the sea still edits our understanding. And so the story of De Vries and his lost chart endures not because it proves anything, but because it feels like the sea talking back. A refusal to let paper be the final word. In Guyana today, especially along the muddy mangroves near Shell Beach, soldier crabs still scuttle by the thousands. They lift debris in their claws, dig their burrows with the patience of tide-worn time. And while they are no cartographers, no custodians of inked knowledge, they do carry something: movement, pattern, instinct, the quiet choreography of the shore. Picture it for a moment. The sun barely risen, a breeze shifting through salt-stained leaves. And there, crawling across a strip of wet sand, a cluster of creatures, as if called to rehearsal, each one lifting something from the beach: twigs, leaves, a coin perhaps, or maybe, just once, the softened corner of a hand-drawn chart, a map of what we almost knew. Perhaps the most meaningful maps are the ones we never quite finish, the ones written, then erased, the ones stolen by wind or claw, only to reappear in pieces where we least expect them. Not precise, not complete, but alive with motion. Our story nears its end now, soft as the tides return. But before we close the chart on this tale, let us pause to consider what a map truly is. Not the thing itself, but the idea behind it. Maps are promises of place. They are memory arranged in shape, time measured in distance, and longing scribbled into direction. Some show what is, others what was, and every so often, a few whisper what might be, if one were only brave or foolish enough to believe them. In 1913, an antiquarian map dealer in Port of Spain acquired a damp scroll of parchment wrapped in oilcloth and twine. It had been brought in by a local fisherman, who claimed his grandfather found it buried near a mangrove clutch decades earlier. The chart, aged and curled at the edges, bore no title, no signature. But on it were strange, looping coastal outlines and a penciled margin note in archaic Dutch: Weggebracht door Klaan, carried away by claws. No one could ever verify its age or origin. The dealer hung it on the back wall of his shop, between an 18th century Caribbean port plan and a reproduction of the Mappa Mundi. When he died, it disappeared, sold with a bundle of forgotten charts to a buyer who never came forward. Years later, in a quiet archive in The Hague, A historian cataloging maritime folklore would come across a record that mentioned the 1712 incident again, not in a naval dispatch, but in the private correspondence of a Dutch officer stationed at Fort Zeeland. The letter read, in part, "The paper lost in the bay was not of much concern, save for the laughter it provoked when the beasts returned it, crumpled and clawed. It seemed even then, among officers and sailors, the tale had been more of a curiosity than a crisis, a passing oddity to mark in the margins of memory. We do not know what the original map contained, whether it detailed a shallow inlet, a hidden cove, or simply marked a minor correction to a coastline no longer recognized. What we do know is that it vanished and then somehow came ashore again, at least according to those who remembered. And sometimes memory is the more durable ink." Across the Atlantic in Senegal, griots, oral historians, tell stories of fishermen who drop stones into the surf while calling the names of their ancestors. Each stone, a point on an invisible map, charting the passage of family, storm, and song. No paper, no ink, but the shape of the world still held in hand. In this way, a map may also be a gesture, a ritual, a rhythm traced in tide. In Micronesia, navigators still speak of stick charts, those lattices of palm fiber and shell once used to read wave refraction and current direction. These maps weren't carried in satchels or locked in chests. They were learned by touch, remembered through feeling, and never taken to sea. They trained the body to know, rather than the eye to see. In a world where wind shifts and water breathes, the best maps were the ones you carried inside. In the same breath, the story of the soldier crabs is not one of loss, but return, an accidental retrieval, a comedy of tide, and perhaps a quiet suggestion that the sea too keeps a record, one not bound in leather or cataloged in drawers, but scuttled and scattered, occasionally brought back ashore by claws that never knew the value of what they held. By now, voyager, the tide in your own room may have softened. The lights dimmed. Perhaps you can hear a soft rustle or creak in the corners of your evening. Not the sound of paper, but maybe of something small shifting nearby. Let it be the echo of tiny feet on wet sand. Let it be the sound of crabs dragging the edge of a forgotten tail back toward the land. What matters isn't whether they truly brought the map ashore. What matters is that we kept telling it. Because stories are like shorelines, shaped by each wave that touches them. Each retelling wears the edge, shifts the grain, smooths or sharpens a feature. And in time, the map becomes not a copy of the world, but a reflection of how we imagined it might behave, if given the chance to rewrite itself. Tonight, we close this map not by folding it neatly, but by letting it drift. Let it ripple once more, out across the dark waters, where soldier crabs still march in clusters and the tide rehearses secrets. Should you ever walk a quiet beach at low tide, look down, not just for shells or driftwood, but for something small, curved, and damp. If it's paper, even in fragments, even if water-blurred or claw-torn, hold it gently. It may be only a scrap, or it may be a map no one else remembers. And if not, well, perhaps the sea will write another. Good night, voyager. Sleep well. Welcome once again, voyager. Tonight, we descend into cool stone and hushed candlelight, into the echo of footsteps beneath frescoed ceilings and soft marble vaults. This is not a tale of stained glass or scripture, but of a compass buried quietly in the shadow of the world's most holy ground. a tale of Jesuits, of old maps, and of tools that once trembled in the wrong hands. Apparently, if you bring a compass into the Vatican, it doesn't always point north. But then again, maybe that's just the cardinals spinning. Before we dive in, if this is the sort of whispering wander you enjoy, remember to like and subscribe, and share your coordinates in the comments below. Tell us where you're listening from, and if an old map or myth once touched your hometown, we'd love to feature it in a future tale. Now, let the edges of your breath soften. Let the air around you slow. Picture candlelight dancing across marble, a draft curling through a high stone corridor. Settle into the silence, where pages once turned by hand and ink took centuries to dry. Our story tonight begins not in Rome, but far to the east, along a coastal inlet in Qing, China, sometime in the early 1600s. Here, Jesuit missionaries were navigating more than language and belief. They were navigating direction itself. At the time, Jesuits were among the few Europeans permitted within the Ming dynasty's imperial court. They brought with them not just scripture, but knowledge, mathematics, astronomy, and tools like the magnetic compass. Unlike the crude iron needles used in Europe, the Chinese had long refined their own navigation systems, suspending finely balanced slivers of lodestone on silk threads, reading water currents and starlight with a sophistication few outsiders grasped. The Jesuits, particularly Matteo Ricci and his companions, were impressed, and in turn shared Western scientific ideas, including cartography. Ricci famously produced the Great Map of 10,000 countries, blending Chinese and European geographic knowledge into one remarkable scroll. But with that gift came suspicion. For many in the East, compasses and sextants seemed eerily precise, unnatural, tools that could summon invisible forces or divide heaven into angles. Some believed they were instruments of sorcery, and so, while scholars admired them, others whispered against them. Jesuits began to hide their instruments when traveling inland, wrapping them in cloth or passing them off as relics. Some buried them during nights at remote missions, unearthing them only under moonlight. This caution would echo westward, carried not by wind but by fear. By 1620, rumors had reached Rome of missionaries accused of strange practices. There were whispers in the corridors of the Inquisition, where suspicion flickered like flame. Most were cautious not to name their brothers too directly, but stories found their way into the margins of letters. A Jesuit in Goa, accused of causing storms by watching the stars. Another in Macau, said to use magnetism to draw ships toward his harbor. Within the Vatican walls, some began to question the wisdom of these scientific missions. Though the Church had long embraced learning, it walked a narrow line between wonder and heresy. Galileo's shadow stretched longer each year, and maps, once a divine art, were becoming too precise for comfort. In this climate, the idea of burying tools became more than caution. It became necessity. There is no single record that speaks of a compass being buried beneath the Vatican, but there are hints, scribbled like notes in the margin of a prayer book. One archivist in the Archivum Secretum, what is now the Vatican Apostolic Archive, mentions an instrument of foreign magnetism, concealed near the Court of Maps. Another, from 1703, refers to a drawer that shall not be opened during conclave, for it disturbs the readings. What exactly disturbed them is unclear. But we know that deep below St. Peter's Basilica lies a network of passageways and chambers, some Roman, some Renaissance, some still sealed. Among these is the Bibliotheca Secreta, once used to house books and maps not deemed fit for the general clergy. Hidden works on astronomy, ancient languages, and at least one worn copy of the Ricci map. Beneath that chamber is the old cartographer's vault, where globes were hung from brass hooks and ink was rationed like wine. A place for scholars who drew the heavens but were advised not to look too long into them. Some say that when Rome was under threat during the Napoleonic invasions, a priest carried a bundle of navigation tools from this vault and placed them into a sealed box near the tomb of an unnamed saint. Others claim the compass, small, worn, and fixed inside a carved olive wood ring, was slipped into the wall itself, behind a fresco in the corridor leading to the map room. We may never know for certain, but the story holds weight for a reason. It touches the tension between belief and measurement, between the divine and the directional. A compass can point north, but it cannot answer why north matters. For the Church, this question was everything. Even now, archivists occasionally find curious entries in the old inventories. Instrumentum ferrum, anise clausa, or iron instrument, axis closed. One cardinal in the 1800s is said to have forbade any drawing of star charts within 100 meters of the archives, fearing they would stir what once spun. But why such fear over a compass? It seems harmless now, a relic, a traveler's keepsake. But for centuries, direction was a matter of trust. Pilgrims walked toward Jerusalem by faith, not azimuth. Sailors set course by stars, but prayed with each sunrise. A device that removed uncertainty was not always welcomed, could make maps speak too clearly, and clarity for some was dangerous. The Jesuits, however, continued their work. They mapped coastlines in Japan, charted rivers in Brazil, and even predicted eclipses in India. Their maps were careful, but so were their hands. A compass might be kept beneath robes or behind altars, wrapped in linen beside crucifixes. One letter from a missionary in the Philippines describes how he kept his magnetic dial inside a hollowed-out Bible, using it only when the villagers were asleep. Another, in New France, said he carved his compass into the base of a wooden cross, turning it like a secret. It was never about magic, only safety, and yet the fear persisted. It lingered in corners, in the way some priests refused to touch maps with metal pointers, using feather quills instead, in how certain churches would not allow compasses near relics, as if magnetism might draw out spirits or disturb the dead. So, buried or not, the idea of a compass beneath the Vatican is a story of caution, of how belief and measurement shared the same halls, but often passed one another in silence. We now drift forward, carried not by tide, but by parchment. By the 18th century, the Vatican had begun collecting maps more aggressively, building one of the largest cartographic archives in Europe. These were not only religious in purpose, but political, scientific, and strategic. And among these shelves, behind red velvet ropes and gilded lockets, a particular map was once found. It was small, no more than a foot in width, its ink fading and hand-labeled in a script that straddled Latin and Portuguese. Across its top was the title Porto de Exilio, Port of Exile. No such place could be located, no coordinates matched, no coastline confirmed. But in the margin of the map was drawn a simple compass rose, far more detailed than the coastlines themselves. Around it, etched in brown ink, were phrases that hinted at its origin. Drawn in the east, corrected beneath vaults. Points only when iron is silent. To be used without moonlight. Archivists dismissed it as fiction, the product of some over-imaginative missionary. But there was another note on its back, almost invisible against the parchment grain. Instrument buried, not destroyed. West corridor, beneath Saint Longinus. The statue of Saint Longinus, sculpted by Bernini, stands inside St. Peter's Basilica, spear in hand, eyes uplifted in revelation. Beneath him lies a passage, once used for processions, now largely closed. Some believe this is where the hidden compass lies. Others think it was a metaphor, a poetic cipher. But the whispers remain. One archivist in the 1930s reportedly went looking. He had spent years cataloging lost instruments and had grown obsessed with the silent axis described in old letters. One evening, long after curfew, he crept into the west corridor with a small oil lamp. A guard found him hours later, staring at the floor beneath Longinus, muttering about the pull and how it didn't point here. He left the archive shortly after. Nothing more was written. It's worth noting that the Vatican is not alone in its relationship with compasses. Across history, many cultures treated direction not as fact, but feeling. The Maori navigators of the Pacific felt current pressure through the soles of their feet in hollow canoes. The Tuareg of the Sahara read wind shifts and shadow lengths, mapping deserts by scent and heat. The early Arabic Qibla finders used astrolabes to determine prayer direction, aligning belief with the stars. A compass, in this sense, was not merely mechanical. It introduced certainty into a world once interpreted by intuition, ritual, or memory. To bury one was not just an act of secrecy, but perhaps reverence, a way to let mystery remain. Back in Rome, some stories say the hidden compass was eventually unearthed during restoration work in the 1950s, when engineers stabilized the corridor foundations. A small box was found within the wall, wooden, olive-toned, with iron clasps rusted to powder. The records of what was inside are vague. One mentions a dial suspended in glass. Another, more cryptically, notes axis recovered, orientation corrected. Yet no object from that excavation appears in any museum. No photo was ever published. Only the corridor was sealed once more, its stone restored as if nothing had passed. And still, within Vatican halls, compasses are rare. Even today, visitors to the cartographic wing are asked to check metal instruments before entering. Not officially, of course, but docents have been known to gently request it, smiling, never quite explaining why. It may be symbolic, or it may be memory, passed quietly down through generations of librarians and monks. A rule that began with fear and ended in tradition. What we do know is that navigation, for the Jesuits and their contemporaries, was never just about geography. It was about time, theology, and the shape of thought. To orient oneself was to define one's place in a creation too vast to map completely. In this way, compasses were not feared because they were precise, but because they revealed how far we still had to go. One final document may hold a clue. It's a letter from a Jesuit scholar to his brother, dated 1712, written from the Collegio Romano. The scholar had just returned from a mission to the Indies and brought back several instruments, including a star compass, said to realign itself during storms. He writes, "I placed the device beneath the maps of the saints, where none shall question its spin. It now rests beside the heart of the world, hidden but turning still." The Collegio Romano sits only a few minutes' walk from the Vatican, and its archives are equally vast. Some researchers believe the compass was stored there, not buried at all. But again, nothing has been confirmed. Perhaps it is better that way. Some stories should remain slightly ajar, like old cabinets in a candlelit library. Doors that don't close, drawers that squeak when opened too far. They invite curiosity, yes, but also caution. And so we leave the corridors now. Let your breath soften once more. Picture again the glow of old lamps across polished stone. Imagine the hush of pages turning in vaulted silence. A whisper of direction wrapped in wood and tucked between the sacred and the scientific. The compass, wherever it may rest, has long since stopped spinning. But the question it carried still circles slowly, like incense in the dark. Our story now winds gently toward the present, not in haste, but in hush. As silence deepens through the halls of the Vatican, another layer of mystery emerges. One written not in Latin or Greek, but in the shape of the building itself. The Vatican is not simply a center of faith. It is a compass in stone. St. Peter's Basilica, viewed from above, reveals a radial design, lines radiating outward from the dome like the spokes of a great wheel. Some scholars, long fascinated by sacred geometry, believe the placement of chapels, niches, and corridors reflects not only symbolic symmetry, but directional knowledge encoded in architecture. A compass, they suggest, was never buried, it was built. There is a small window, just beneath the dome, where on certain days of the year, sunlight lands on the floor in a perfect alignment with the main altar. It is said that this was by design, that the light marked both solstice and equinox, allowing priests to orient liturgical calendars with the sky. Navigation, once again woven with devotion. Elsewhere, the Vatican's gardens house older clues. One path curves like a spiral, ending at a stone with no inscription. A few researchers have linked its position with magnetic anomalies recorded in the area, but such theories are quickly dismissed, folded back into the fabric of polite denial. Yet the stories persist, told softly, like prayers. There is a tale, shared among archivists late in the evening, about a monk who walked the same route each morning before sunrise. For 40 years, he was never seen to deviate. Always the same pattern, down the corridor behind the statue of St. Helena, past the mosaic of the shepherd, up the narrow stairwell near the apostolic library. When asked why, he would smile and say only, "I follow the old arrow." When he passed away, no arrow was found, but etched into the side of his wooden desk, beneath layers of ink stains and candle wax, was a drawing. Compass rose, one line carved deeper than the rest, as if traced over again and again. Back beyond Rome, across oceans and continents, similar patterns appear. In Jesuit missions from China to Brazil, hidden beneath chapel floors or behind classroom walls, old instruments have been uncovered, some wrapped in cloth, others embedded in brick, each one altered in subtle ways. A reversed needle, a missing cardinal mark, a central axis fixed in place. It's as if these compasses were meant to point somewhere not of the earth, but of thought. Not north or south, but inward. Perhaps the fear was never about the compass itself, but what it allowed, a way to navigate without confession, to orient without absolution. In an age where the heavens told stories and stars held saints, direction had to pass through doctrine. Anything else was suspect, and so, to keep wonder sacred, it was hidden. Today, if you visit the Vatican museums and walk slowly, you may feel a quiet pull in certain rooms. Not a draft, not a breeze, but something subtler. A sense of alignment, of being gently turned, as though the air itself nudges your shoulder, inviting you to face a different way. In the gallery of maps, green and gold frescoes stretch the length of the hall, depicting Italy in radiant medieval artistry. But tucked near the ceiling, above the painted coastlines and mountains, is a solitary emblem, a needle wrapped by vine. It appears only once. Some believe this was the artist's homage to the buried compass. Others say it's merely decoration. But as with all such symbols, its power lies in its placement, and in the minds of those who notice it. As the story draws to a close, let us return to that quiet moment. The one when the compass was lowered gently into earth or marble, wrapped in linen, kissed by breath and sealed away. Whether beneath the Vatican stones or inside a scholar's drawer, the act was one of reverence, a way to hold direction still even when the world moved too quickly. Let your body ease now, like a needle settling on calm waters. Let thought drift toward sleep, guided not by points on a map, but by the soft spin of curiosity. Imagine candlelight flickering across frescoes, the echo of footsteps on marble, the trace of iron beneath stone. The compass waits not to be found, but to be felt. And tonight, perhaps you have turned just slightly toward it. Thank you for joining this quiet journey. If you found yourself gently carried, please leave your coordinates in the comments so we know where the needle has pointed you from. Like and subscribe if you'd like to be guided back to us again. Good night, Voyager. The vaults are closed, the maps rolled, the stars outside still turning, and beneath it all, the compass rests, unburied in you. Welcome, Voyager. Tonight we drift on air rather than water, tracing not a coastline but the weightless path of breeze through time. Our story comes from the days when every gust had a name and every direction carried not just weather but intent. The ancients, particularly the Greeks, did not speak of wind in terms of pressure gradients or low fronts. Instead, they spoke of Boreas, the cold one from the north, and Notus, the sultry breath of the south. To sail with or against a wind wasn't just meteorology, it was divine mood. And so tonight we sail not by compass, but by temperament. Before we set sail on whispering gusts and old myths, don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoy these quiet voyages into time's geography. Drop your coordinates in the comments, your city, your bay, your breeze, and if there's a story from your wind-tossed coast, we might just feature it in a future tale. Now settle in. Let your thoughts fall away like dry leaves in an autumn draft. Let the air grow soft around your shoulders, steady and directionless, like the hush that lingers after a storm. Inhale once more, as the ancients did, wondering not just what the wind brings, but who. Our story tonight begins in the craggy archipelago of ancient Greece, where the Aegean Sea meets sky, and the sky answers in gusts. Long before modern meteorology gave us names like cyclone and trade wind, the people of this region listened for something more personal. The winds were not faceless currents. They had identities, temperaments, and sometimes even temples. The Greeks believed the world was surrounded by elemental forces, and among them, the animally, the winds, were four of the most important. Each of the cardinal directions had its own deity. From the north came Boreas, fierce and loud, cloaked in snow. His breath was seen as punishing but purifying, and it was said that his arrival cracked the olives and stilled the fig trees. In Athens, he was revered as a protector, credited with sinking Persian ships during an attempted invasion in 480 BC. The myth says Boreas was so fond of Athens that he came to its aid like a jealous storm. A small sanctuary, or temenos, was built in his honor on the banks of the Ilissos River, where offerings were left to win his favor, or at least his restraint. From the south came Notus, bringer of heavy summer rain and late harvest storms. His breath was damp and heady, known to spoil wine jars and swell the rivers that flowed into the Mediterranean. While he wasn't feared like Boreas, Notus was approached with caution. Mariners waited for his withdrawal before sailing. Farmers watched his coming like a final guest at the feast, one that might tip over the table. He was less personified than Boreas, but no less respected. The western wind, Zephyrus, was something different altogether. He arrived with spring, light-footed and fragrant. Associated with blooming fields and soft tides, Zephyrus was invoked by poets and sailors alike. He was gentle, reliable, and always on time. In Homer's Odyssey, Odysseus prays for Zephyrus to fill his sails, a quiet partner in long journeys. Artists often painted him with cheeks puffed in delicate breath, his arms wrapped around flowers, or embracing the goddess Chloris, with whom he was said to have birthed the blooms of spring. And from the east came Eurus, perhaps the least defined of the four. Changeable and swift, Eurus was a storm bearer, sometimes helpful, often erratic. In literature, he arrives with darkening skies and abrupt departures. He didn't have a temple to his name, but he appeared in oaths and warnings. When a traveler vanished in the hills, it was sometimes said Eurus carried them into the clouds. These four anemoi were not abstractions. They shaped architecture, agriculture, and navigation. The Tower of the Winds in Athens still stands as testament. Erected in the 2nd century BCE, this octagonal marble tower once served as a combination sundial, weather vane, and water clock. Each of its 8 faces was dedicated to a wind, carved in relief. Boreas is shown as a bearded man in heavy cloak, Zephyrus as a youth scattering blossoms. It was a monument to observation and belief, blending science and story in clean symmetry. In many coastal villages, local winds were given nicknames that borrowed from these classical gods, or were folded into their identities. A sudden northerly gust might be called Boreas, regardless of its actual source. On the islands of the Cyclades, elderly sailors would still mutter that Zephyrus has not yet opened his eye, when the spring seas remained too cold for fishing. These were not just metaphors, but tools, ways of explaining what could not yet be measured. Roman mythology later adapted the anemoi into their own pantheon. Boreas became Aquilo, Notus turned into Auster, Zephyrus into Favonius, and Eurus retained his name. While the Romans were more interested in practical winds for military logistics and empire building, the poetic weight of the four persisted. Ovid describes Favonius as the breath that opens the buds of the trees. Even in expansion, the myth held winds, no matter the empire, arrived with intention. Beyond Greece and Rome, the tradition of naming winds persisted across geography and time. The Mistral of southern France, cold and merciless, is still blamed for tempers and quick decisions. The Sirocco, blowing from the Sahara across the Mediterranean, was thought to carry not only dust but melancholy. In Arabic-speaking regions, winds like the Shamal and Khamsin came with both meteorological and emotional implications. In Japan, the kamikaze, or divine wind, was once credited with saving the nation from Mongol invasion in the 13th century. Every place has had its version of the anemoi, but nowhere were they more personified than in the stone and song of ancient Greece. Here, in valleys lined with olive groves and sea cliffs sharp as flutes, the wind did not just blow. It arrived with character. It carried stories. It shaped thought. We continue inland, where wind behaves differently, no longer pulled by tide or shaped by headland, but guided by mountain passes and the architecture of cities. In places like Delphi, nestled between the folds of Mount Parnassus, the direction of the wind was considered when consulting oracles. A favorable breeze was said to sharpen visions, while an unexpected draft during a ritual might send priests back to their altars, convinced the gods were unsettled. The philosopher Aristotle, curious about everything that stirred the natural world, attempted to catalog winds in his work Meteorologica. He wrote of 12 directional winds and their unique influences, blending careful observation with inherited names. But even he admitted that wind defied certainty. It was a phenomenon that could be studied but never fully controlled. What mattered most, he suggested, was knowing how to listen. This idea of wind as something that could be heard as much as felt found its way into the sailing traditions of the Mediterranean. Greek ships, often square-rigged and shallow-keeled, were at the mercy of prevailing winds. Mariners memorized seasonal patterns, watching the sea's surface for signs. A choppy patch might signal a change. Gulls flying inland might suggest a storm, but it was often sound that gave the earliest warning. The whistling between sails, the low hum across the water's surface, the rustle through pine near the shore, these were cues passed between generations. Sailors trained their ears to recognize the song of Boreas or the sigh of Notus long before the horizon shifted. In literature, the winds appear as characters more often than conditions. In the Odyssey, Homer describes how Odysseus received a leather bag filled with storm winds from Aeolus, keeper of the Anemoi. Only the gentle Zephyrus was left outside to guide him home. But curiosity undid the gift. His crew, thinking it gold, opened the bag, releasing the trapped gales. The resulting chaos drove their ship off course. This tale, while wrapped in myth, carried a real warning. The winds may be friendly, but they are not to be trifled with. In later retellings, Aeolus was sometimes said to live in a floating island. Forever surrounded by storms he tamed with rope and command. His island was described in different ways, sometimes volcanic, sometimes forested, but always unreachable by ordinary men. A metaphor, perhaps, for the unknowable nature of weather itself. As Rome inherited the seas, its navigators adopted and adapted these traditions. Roman merchant ships, though sturdier, still deferred to wind patterns. Pliny the Elder, in his Natural History, described how winds influenced trade routes and dictated planting cycles. He noted that certain winds came with illnesses or carried seeds and insects across regions. Some ships, he warned, should not attempt certain voyages during the time of Auster, the southern wind, for it could bring heavy, blinding rains. This was not superstition, it was hard-won knowledge passed down through observation and repetition. Mapmakers of the time, especially during the Hellenistic and Roman periods, began inscribing wind roses onto their charts, compasses without magnets, just etched directions named for the anemoi. These diagrams didn't just guide sailors. They helped scholars align temples, construct cities, and even plan battles. To turn your face to the wrong wind was to risk more than discomfort. It was to risk disaster. Even inland, wind had presence. In Thessaly, windmills were designed not just to harness force, but to rotate with seasonal change. Farmers would paint one blade white to help mark direction during storms. Wind was a clock, a calendar, a messenger. And when Christianity spread across Europe, the personified winds faded somewhat, but they did not disappear. Medieval monks often copied Roman texts, preserving the names of the four principal winds, albeit tucked between newer saints and calendar feasts. In cathedral carvings, faces still puffed cheeks over oceans, a quiet nod to the anemoi. And in certain liturgical chants, winds were still invoked as carriers of divine intent. One Benedictine hymn prays for Zephyrus to carry peace upon the wheat. The preservation of these wind deities was not limited to the West. Islamic scholars of the Golden Age, working in centers like Baghdad and Cordoba, translated Aristotle's and Ptolemy's works into Arabic. They cataloged winds for navigation, astrology, and irrigation. The polymath Al-Kindi wrote about how specific winds carry different qualities, influencing both physical health and spiritual mood. While he didn't name them as gods, the winds still had personality and consequence. In China, during the same centuries, winds were mapped into the broader cosmology of qi, the vital force. The seasonal winds, particularly the east wind, Dongfeng, were associated with renewal and were given ceremonial importance during festivals and farming rituals. Sailors of the treasure fleet under Admiral Zheng He timed their voyages with the monsoon cycles, which they described with reverence and respect. The Indian Ocean's mousom winds were not only predictable, they were welcomed like royal guests, their arrival marked with chants and offerings. But no matter the culture, the common thread remained. Wind was more than weather, carried meaning, direction, voice. In some Aegean islands, this personification lingers still. Old men sitting in cafes may mutter that Boreas is angry today, when shutters rattle unexpectedly. Children are taught not to whistle at night, lest it awaken Zephyrus. Tourists might see this as charm or folklore, But those who've lived there long enough understand it differently. When you grow up in a place where wind reshapes cliffs and determines when boats return, you learn to listen as if it's speaking directly to you. Even the language remembers. In Greek, the word for wind, animos, is rooted in breath. It is where we get the term anemometer, the tool that measures wind speed. But before the tool, there was only the ear and the name and the story. Tonight, the winds have quieted. There is no Auster tugging at your window pane, no Boreas howling down the chimney, just the steady exhale of the present, a piece the ancients would have called a gift from Zephyrus. Our story tonight now drifts to the cliffs of southern France, where in the 18th century, a series of caves were discovered near a place called Gargas. Etched onto the walls were handprints, animals, and symbols whose meaning was long debated. But there, carved subtly among the lines, was a spiral that many believe represented wind. Not the shape of it, but its motion, a movement remembered by those who lived in landscapes shaped by breath and gust. Before language, before writing, the wind was drawn as a swirl, traced in ochre. Thousands of miles away, in the Sami regions of northern Scandinavia, wind is still something to be called for, not merely forecast. Reindeer herders use drums to speak to it, asking it to shift, to clear fog, or to slow a coming storm. The direction of wind determined the rhythm of migration, the position of camps, even the choice of song. A northerly wind might require one chant, a southerly another. It wasn't superstition, but memory, woven into rhythm. Likewise, in Polynesia, the master navigators of the open Pacific gave names not only to the stars, but to the ocean's many winds. On islands like Satawal or Puka Puka, there was no single word for wind. Each direction brought a different word, and those winds carried the identity of voyages. A journey wasn't from island to island. It was from the land of the western wind to the home of the sunrise gust. Even today, oral chants recall which wind will lift a canoe and which will press it flat. These chants, passed through generations, were not poems, but instructions. One such wind, called Moanui, was known to rise quickly near certain coral atolls. It was fast, dry, and quiet, ideal for cutting across the open sea. But if it arrived too late in the season, it could push a sailor too far west, to where the stars became unfamiliar. It was said the great navigator Mau Pielug once waited 7 extra days on land, refusing to leave until Moanui's touch was on the trees, not the waves. When he did depart, he reached his destination with just enough water left to speak of the journey. In North Africa, the sirocco is still feared and admired. This hot, dusty wind from the Sahara can sweep across the Mediterranean, turning skies yellow and warming cities overnight. Ancient Berber traders called it the lion's breath, and believed it arrived when the desert remembered something. Farmers along the coast of Tunisia would trim olive branches in anticipation, not to protect the tree, but to test how the wind bent the leaves. A sudden twist meant the sirocco would last longer than usual, and extra stores of water would be needed. Meanwhile, in Japan, the wind took on a spiritual clarity. The kamikaze, or divine wind, was named after the typhoons that repelled Mongol invasions in the 13th century. Whether coincidence or weather, those storms became part of national lore, believed to have been summoned by ancestral forces to protect the islands. Shrines were later built near coastal cliffs, where wind chimes were hung not just for their sound, but to carry prayers into the air. The chimes were tuned to certain pitches, thought to resonate better with specific winds. Some still hang today, rusted and soft with time, but moving just the same. Back in the Mediterranean, the Tower of the Winds in Athens still stands. Built in the 1st century BCE, this marble octagonal structure was topped with a weather vane in the form of Triton, and each of its 8 faces was carved with the personification of a wind. It wasn't merely decorative. The tower housed one of the world's earliest water clocks and sundials, with each side marking both time and wind. In this way, time flowed with the air, and measurement became part of motion. It's easy to forget, in our climate-controlled interiors, just how intimately people once lived with the wind. Not just noticing it, but depending on it. Before engines, before steam, before satellites and forecasts, wind was both map and compass, both warning and companion. Today, many of those ancient names are gone from our weather reports. The anemoi are no longer summoned, and the spirits of wind do not appear on satellite imagery. But some knowledge lingers. Sailors still learn to read clouds and flags. Pilots still respect the crosswind. And in poetry, in lullabies, the wind remains a bearer of change. Somewhere tonight, there is a kite straining at its string, a weather vane turning with a gust that was born 3 days ago over some forgotten hill. Someone is standing on a balcony, eyes closed, letting the breeze stir their thoughts. And perhaps someone else is sleeping, half dreaming of voices on the wind, hearing in them old names like Zephyrus or Notice, carried quietly forward through time. So let your breath move gently, like a forgotten draft through long grass. Let the blankets rise and fall with the same rhythm as sails, soft and slow. Tonight, we do not need a compass. The wind, ancient and familiar, will know the way. Thank you for traveling with me tonight, Voyager. May the breezes be kind wherever you are. If a wind near you once carried a story or turned a journey, let us know by leaving your coordinates in the comments below. Until then, rest well, and let the gods of air sing you softly to sleep.